Welcome to today's Dharma talk. And the topic of today's Dharma talk is compassion. And what I'd like to do is clarify the understanding of compassion, its near and far enemies, which include fears, blocks, and resistance to compassion, and how we can cultivate it. So, one common definition of compassion used in contemporary psychology and also other places is that which has been offered by His Holiness the Dalai Lama as a sensitivity to suffering in self and others with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. So that's a neat little description of compassion. There's lots of other descriptions. Sometimes I've heard it called a quivering of the heart in response to suffering. And yeah, there's a whole range of definitions, but that one's pretty good. And that description has two components. One is an awareness of suffering, and the other component is the motivation to alleviate and possibly find some freedom from it. So compassion has three flows in the dualistic world anyway. Self to other, other to self, and self to self. If we consider self to other and other to self, a major component, that sensitivity to suffering, could refer to empathy. And empathy has a number of different types, actually. And normally we understand empathy as kind of feeling in to what's happening with another person as if it is our own experience without losing that as ifness. That's I'm just quoting Carl Rogers there. That as if, what as if means there is that we're able to differentiate between what is our suffering and what is another's. And that's a really major component. So Paul Ekman, a renowned expert on emotions, highlights there being three types of empathy. The first type of empathy he talks about is cognitive empathy, which is where we know at a cognitive level, at a thinking level, what's happening in another person. And this is really useful, especially useful for managers and say in a workplace to work out what's going on with other people, to know what they're feeling or experiencing is helpful for them to set, procedures and policies and so on. But cognitive empathy, I think, is also what, say, the psychopath may experience. There's sayings that some people say that a psychopath doesn't have empathy. Well, I think a psychopath may have a lot of cognitive empathy, or a narcissist even, because they may know what's happening in another person in order to manipulate them. So it can be quite risky and dangerous. Another type of empathy that Ekman talks about is emotional empathy. And this relates to feeling what another person is feeling. So again, this can be fantastic to kind of tune into what another person's feeling and feel their experience. However, sometimes there's people called empaths, or sometimes we can tune into another person's suffering without having that differentiation between what's theirs and ours, and then we suffer with them. So in other words, sometimes we will be overwhelmed with our sensitivity to the suffering of another person. So it's just something to be aware of. Actually, this could be called in some ways a near enemy of compassion, being overwhelmed by the suffering of another. And the third type of empathy that Ekman relates is called compassionate empathy. And it involves empathy in combination with good intent. The person, and it involves that empathy that has a differentiation between what is my stuff and what is the other person's stuff. It is that Daniel Siegel calls it differentiation, and I would call it equanimity. It's an understanding that everyone's on their own life trajectories, everyone's on their own stories, and only they have, only they can set the course of their life directions. Only they experience their karma, so to speak. So the suffering that people have is theirs. There's a differentiation between theirs and mine. Yet, if we can sense it, if we can be sensitive to it, if we can empathize it with compassion, then it's that compassion is protective. So with compassion and empathy, the compassion flows for another, and it is sustainable and uplifting. It is a state of well-being, which is what we're talking about when we talk about compassion as being one of the divine abodes. The importance of empathy was highlighted in a report about a conversation the Buddha had with a royal couple actually. This royal couple came to the Buddha and wanted to know, who does one love the most? Do they love each other, the other person the most, or themselves? And this is what the Buddha was reported to have said. Covering every direction with the mind, one finds no one one loves more than oneself. In the same way, others love their own self. Therefore, one who loves himself or herself or their self does not harm another. Now, it's a bit kind of tricky to get an understanding of that, but the way I think, what I think that means, it emphasizes the importance of our self-reference and how all beings don't wish to experience dukkha. And all beings have a yearning for happiness, to be happy, to wish to protect their happiness, and they don't want to experience dukkha. With empathy, it becomes difficult to harm another because harming another is just like harming ourselves. With empathy, we can see that they have hopes, dreams, fears, pain, etc., just like ourselves, and we know how that feels. So the greater one has empathy, the more difficult it is to harm another. And when kindness has no bounds, when compassion has no bounds, or we're experiencing that sense of being in the state of an awakened state, for example, it becomes impossible to harm another. So most of you know about the Four Truths and the Four Noble Truths. I'll just briefly, these are not the foundation. These are this is the synthesis. This is the summary of the Buddhist teachings, basically, the Four Noble Truths. You know, there is dukkha, there is unsatisfactoriness or suffering, or and it's on a spectrum of gross, meaning the terrible sufferings that we experience in the world, like from aging, sickness, and death, to pain, grief, lamentation, and despair, and so on, right down to the subtle types of unsatisfactoriness we may have. And I usually make a joke about this, about not having our soy chai latte exactly as we like it. You know, it's just not exactly the right temperature, for example, or it just hasn't got the right picture on the top of its foam. There's a subtle sense of unsatisfactoriness. That's dukkha, and this is the reality of life. The second noble truth is that there is the origins of dukkha, being the Buddha says it's craving, and craving leads up to this whole mass of this whole cycle of suffering that's driven by greed, ignorance, and hatred. Greed being grasping after the pleasant, hatred being aversion to the unpleasant, pushing it away, and ignorance being, sometimes ignorance is called delusion, not seeing things as they actually are, ignoring the way things are. The third truth, of course, is the realization of freedom. To the extent that we let go of the causes, To that extent, we experience freedom. And the fourth truth, of course, is the path to freedom. So in the suttas, in the first sutta, actually, the Buddha described how these four truths are kind of in a sequence. And the sequence goes like this. It goes, from first truth through to the fourth truth. We begin with kind of like a task of understanding dukkha. We realize dukkha, and what happens is the task of that realization is to understand it, to understand dukkha. In other words, to turn towards dukkha, to see into it, to see it clearly so that we can understand it. And when we do that, we start to realize the origins of dukkha, which are in our hearts, not necessarily in the external world, but more so in how we react to the events that come our way. That's not to deny the fact that there's tsunamis and there's terrible wars, and a lot of people don't, have lots of dukkha just coming from the world. But there is a difference in how we relate to the dukkha that comes our way. If we can see that the way we relate to dukkha that comes our way, the way we relate to the experiences that come our way, enable us to be free from the suffering related to those events, then we're starting to realize that the causes of these of our being caught up in a bind. So, first truth is dukkha. The task of the first truth is to understand it. Second truth is origins of dukkha. The task of this is to release them. Task of this truth is to release the causes of dukkha. And then what happens is we realize freedom, whether it's relative or absolute. We realize, to the extent that we let go, we realize to that extent freedom. The task of the third truth, freedom, or nibbana sometimes it's called, is to recognize it, is to realize it, is to, I could hardly say acknowledge it, but sort of like recognizing it and realizing it. And when we do that, it leads on to the fourth truth. We have a way of practicing. We'll have a way of living this enlightenment or this awakening. And the task of the fourth truth, which is often understood as the Eightfold Path, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The task of that is to live it, is to practice. So when we consider this framework of the four truths, compassion could be considered as the capacity to turn towards suffering of self or other, and hold it in our hearts with wisdom. It's the capacity to be willing to face up to this first truth so that we can understand it. And rather than trying to fix our suffering and get rid of the pain, we allow the transformation from suffering or dukkha to liberation to occur by not feeding into it, with the origins of dukkha being, greed, ignorance, and hatred. Rather than avoiding, which is in fact an expression of that root cause of hatred or aversion, we approach dukkha. We turn towards it with right intentions of letting go, goodwill, and harmlessness. Compassion also, compassion accesses our natural caring and sharing systems, and are wholesome responses to ease the pain of the First Noble Truth. It gives us the resources and the capacity to actually face up to dukkha, ironically. And when we consider the world out there with horrendous suffering of war and pandemics, starvation, genocide, climate change, homelessness, and the list is endless, compassionate responses to others and the suffering of the world seems essential if we want to survive as humans in our human race. Compassionate actions are one obvious way to cultivate compassion. The more we feel inclined to act compassionately towards another, the more that will become the tendency of our mind. And some could say that sitting on a retreat, away separate from the world, is not really engaging in compassionate action. However, in my opinion, such internal work of cultivating compassion not only primes us to act compassionately in the world, compassionately as we encounter suffering in the world, but it also works towards releasing the root causes of suffering, that delusion of separateness and the delusion of selfish egocentricity, and the delusion and the tendency of hatred, that root cause of hatred and aversion. In the cultivation of compassion, it's helpful to know about its near and far enemies, which include fears, blocks, and resistance to compassion. Some of you may have heard me talk about near and far enemies. Some of you may not. Just to remind you, a far enemy of one of these qualities, of the high qualities, is their direct opposites. For example, the far enemy of compassion include sadism, masochism, vengefulness, and cruelty. That's the direct opposite of this tendency to be able to be sensitive to suffering and have the wish or the commitment to alleviate it or release it. A near enemy of a particular quality looks like this quality, but it is in fact is a false facsimile, is a false representation. And some of the near enemies of compassion include a kind of sense of rescuing, like jumping in and fixing the problem before there's an opportunity to understand it, or jumping in and fixing a problem because we can't stand the pain of seeing it. We're not willing to face up to our own discomfort about seeing another suffer. Another near enemy of compassion is burnout, or it's called compassion fatigue, but it's really empathy fatigue. It's this, which happens a lot with health workers, I think, that tendency to just kind of get so overwhelmed with all the suffering in the world that we just burn out. We lose any, we lose the capacity, we lose the energy to want to help another, to engage in anything. It's just so overwhelming. And this, it might look like compassion, but in fact, we're experiencing a near enemy of it. And another near enemy of compassion is kind of like patronizing pity. Patronizing pity, like, they're, and I won't, I'm thinking about the stolen generation. You remember that? You remember that ridiculous feeling that one race was superior over another, and we had pity on them, so we tried to rescue them or something like that. That was absolutely absurd. But anyway, patronizing pity is another near enemy of compassion. And as I mentioned earlier, another near enemy of compassion is reactive rejection and condemnation of emotional pain. Just like I was saying, sometimes we might witness someone suffering, and rather than just being with them, sharing that time with them, holding their suffering, helping them hold their suffering, or being there as a compassionate other. We try to fix it all because it's us that can't stand the suffering of witnessing them. So it's understandable that there may be resistance to compassion because it begins to ask us to understand suffering and its causes. This requires that we don't follow habitual patterns of avoidance and courageously come into contact with our dukkha. Often this will require commitment, courage, sensitivity, and the capacity to tolerate distress. So, one fear of compassion is the understandable fear of suffering. Sadly, our fears of compassion block us from opening our hearts. When I was doing mindful self-compassion teacher training, I heard there was a monastic that developed a formula for suffering. It went like something like this. Suffering equals pain times resistance. And many of you can remember, many of you have done mindful self-compassion may remember that formula. In other words, there's two components to suffering. It has to have the pain as well as the resistance to the pain. If you take out the resistance, then there's just pain. And if we have just pain, it's possible to just see it as pain, not take it personally, see it as a condition, and be free and have no suffering with it. So when we take out the resistance, we don't make the pain worse by taking it personally. Our fear of compassion is also evident with a block of compassion flowing from us. Again, this could be related to our fear of empathizing with another suffering. And I've just talked a little bit about how we sometimes react to try to fix things before there's an opportunity to sit and be with something. Sometimes when we are confronted with the suffering of another, not only do we jump in and try to fix it, but sometimes we could also get angry. And we could also get self-righteous and have a tendency of either engaging in blame for ourselves and judgment of ourselves or the other, without understanding the deeper causes. But it is often about not understanding and being able to see the deeper causes and the interdependence of things, of how things come to be. That is the problem. That is the resistance. That is a block for us to not realize and actualize genuine compassion. There's a very moving poem written by the late and venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. That's called Call Me By My True Names. And many of you know this poem very well. But there's one verse that really, whenever I hear it, I almost come to tears. So hopefully I won't come to tears. Well, it doesn't matter if I come to tears now when I read it. But this is the verse. I'm the 12-year-old child. I'm sorry, I'll say it again. I'm the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself in the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. I am the pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. This life is a complex web of interactions. Not seeing this complexity, not seeing these interactions, not seeing that that there's so many things happening that we can't really take it on as being personal. Not seeing this web of interactions is a block. It's a block to letting in and allowing compassion to flow to us and from us. Okay. So I mentioned just a moment ago that with some health workers, for example, we experience empathy fatigue, and it's a near enemy of compassion. It is a near enemy because at the surface level, it looks like compassion, but it's not. Rather than being sustainable, uplifting, and divine, we feel like we've got nothing left to give. We are fatigued by efforts, and we would rather turn away from the suffering than resonate with it. This is how we can distinguish between a near enemy of a divine abode and the actual abode. And I remember there was basically this is with the genuine experience, we are uplifted and sustained. And with the near enemy, we become fatigued. I remember there was a study with Mathieu Ricard where his brain patterns were monitored with fMRI. I think it was fMRI, and they asked him to have empathy for some beings, and I think he was thinking about some orphans in an Eastern Bloc country. And as he thought about these beings, all the pain centers lit up in his brain. So, and when he was interviewed later, he said, "Oh, that was very difficult to do that." He was asked to have empathy without compassion. So he tuned into it, and he had this response. But when he was asked to have compassion, he came back saying he could go on forever. It was sustainable and it was uplifting. So when I began working as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist over 30 years ago, it took me about a week to realize that if I didn't bring the compassion, the equanimity that I developed from my meditation practices to my clinical roles, I'd be unable to continue. Clinicians like myself often hear about and witness suffering on a daily basis. And sometimes we suffer vicariously. Equanimity has a balancing effect on all the abodes, and including compassion. And what it helps us realize is that individuals can only heal themselves. Humans, as I've talked about at different times, the way we are as humans comes about as a result of many causes and conditions coming together, many of which are completely beyond our control. And as individuals suffer many experiences, it's not their fault. And I remember Paul Gilbert has said this in response to the suffering of people who have been the victims of trauma or neglect or abuse and neglect as children. He said something like, our suffering is not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And this is what happens with equanimity. We see that the reasons for the suffering comes about because of so many causes and conditions coming together. And nobody else can go in and resolve that suffering other than the person that it's hard to say this, but the person it is happening to. That makes sense. Only they can act in ways and respond to that suffering in ways that will be liberating, not another. So as a clinician, I understand that. And I do sometimes, obviously, I do sometimes suffer with the near enemy of compassion when I'm seeing my clients. Sorry, yes, the near enemy of compassion when I see my clients. However, I can eventually work some freedom from this when I have equanimity. I can reestablish my equanimity. So everyone's on their own life trajectories, and another being cannot enter into an individual's body, heart, mind continuum of their lives. Only the individuals can do that. Another heart quality that can protect compassion from turning into its near enemy is appreciative joy, which is interesting. With this quality, we become sensitive to the good, the positive, and the joyous things of life with appreciation. Like good news stories can balance the overwhelm of bad news stories, appreciative joy can help us remember the joy of life. And it counterbalances the tendency to just focus on and be overwhelmed with some suffering. Sometimes individuals, and the research indicates more females with this, but anyway, sometimes individuals may find it easy to generate compassion for another. However, often due to low self-esteem or feeling undeserving or socio-cultural expectations, when it comes to themselves, they find self-compassion very difficult. In the Mindful Self-Compassion program developed by Germer and Neff, participants are invited to consider their misgivings about self-compassion and compassion in general, actually, and question the validity of their beliefs. They'll be asked, or the participants will ask, what are some of your misgivings? What are you cautious about? Why are you not engaging in this? And typically some of the following, as listed in the MSc program, Teachers Leaders Guideline actually comes up. They consider that self-compassion is selfish. Self-compassion is self-indulgent. Self-compassion is a form of making excuses. Self-compassion is a form of self-pity. Self-compassion, and often people in general think that compassion is weak. And self-compassion will undermine motivation. As it turns out, with investigation, including empirical evidence from scientific research, these beliefs have no validity. So there are many ways to work with the near and far enemies and the fears, blocks, and resistances. Some ways with the far enemies, meaning the opposites of these, what we do is we cultivate the particular quality. But with the near enemies, and including our fears and blocks and resistances, some ways we could work with them is simply by questioning our beliefs, by questioning and investigating into these beliefs, such as, it's a form of self-pity, or I'm not good enough to have some self-compassion, or, it's a form of pity or indulgence or whatever. Just questioning and refuting those beliefs with evidence, as we do in cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Other times, a deeper experiential therapy or deeper experiential approach may be used. And this is, I think this is akin to understanding how we work with the hindrances in meditation. You all know the hindrances, obsessive sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, or restlessness and anxiety, and paralyzing self-doubt. With these hindrances, there's specific ways to work with specific hindrances, and they can be tailored. But an overall way of working with them in general is to firstly become aware of them, to acknowledge them, to realize them, to see them, and then work in a way where you don't feed into them. So in this case, all the 7 factors of awakening might come into practice. 7 factors of awakening is being mindful of it, investigating into it, then rousing energy around it. Then when you start to see some of freedom from it, there is some joy, which leads to tranquility, which leads to concentration, and eventually equanimity. These are some of the ways we work with the hindrances, and we can consider the fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion as work in the same way. We can work with them in the same way of turning attention to them, tuning into them, understanding them, and then finding some freedom from them. Okay. So there's specific instructions in the meditation practices. And if you want to cultivate, in the cultivation of compassion, there's specific instructions. Some of these instructions emphasize to never force it, allow it to come in a natural way, and use as appropriate whatever works to kind of kindle this feeling. And you can focus on intentions or aspirations, recitation of phrases, bringing attention to the signs of these qualities and nourishing them. And then using the same processes that we use with serenity meditation practices, as I was mentioning in the introduction, to like those 5 factors, the 5 jhana factors, where we attend to something, where it's initial application, sustained application, joy or piti, sukha or happiness, and then unification of mind. Around these, this heart quality, around compassion, so that you just sort of get absorbed into it. What I find is that if I can rouse the experience of compassion, the sign of compassion, when I bring my attention back to it, it's like I'm kind of keeping it up, so to speak. I'm just sort of, it's like touching a balloon that you keep in the air. It's just this gentle touching, and it becomes more sustained, and eventually it's effortless to stay involved with it. It's just this absorption into that quality. Also, these states of heart mind, these like compassion, can arise in daily activities, in our daily lives, as a natural response to situations where individuals might find themselves in. Like, for example, in daily life, we may witness the suffering of another, and there's a natural compassionate response. It's useful to be mindful of that natural compassionate response. Get familiar with it so that at another time you can remember it and bring it to mind, and that will enable you to kindle that quality. In all the advice in the Buddhist teachings, they also say avoiding the company of the unwise, the rude, the abusive, the unkind, and keeping company with those who are wise, kind, supportive, compassionate, and joyous, just like we're doing today, being in company with good friends, supporting our practice. Being part of a friendly community can also help melt alienation and engender a sense of belonging and connection, just like we are right now. We're part of a little community here, our little sangha. But we also have greater communities. My friend from my neighbor, I think he's 82 years old. He loves to bring down oranges and mangoes and all sorts of things. And he brought down a bag of mangoes just before I was giving this Dharma talk. There's this sense of connecting with others, and there's a natural response of compassion. I remember being during the flood. Many of you know that there was a disaster here almost 2 years ago. 2 years ago? Yeah, 2 years ago. In Lismore, we were flooded, and there was lots of suffering. It's one can't help but want to engage in the community to help. And this helping engenders and cultivates compassion. So I just want to kind of mention something about emptiness and compassion. And you may think, well, emptiness is a feature of Buddhist meditation practices. For those of you who aren't familiar with emptiness, basically it refers to how we are not independent, separate beings in this world. We are part of an interconnected whole. We are part of we're not separate things, but streams of dependently arising processes and interactions. That we're not we are not this fiction that we create. Neuroscientists are saying that the self, that which is called the self, is in fact a fiction created by default mode networking and also the impact of left hemispheric dominance and language, the language centers of the left hemisphere. They all come together to create this story about who and what we are. And in fact, it's just a story. So emptiness here means that we are not that separate. We are empty of separate individual thingness. And this is a reality of Buddhism. And there was there are several other ways of understanding emptiness in Buddhism. And in an encounter with a Buddhist monk called Nagasena, about 1,000 years after the Buddha's passing, there was an encounter with the Buddhist monk Nagasena with a Greek king called Menander. And the great king came and questioned Nagasena about the tenets of Buddhism, and he introduced himself to Nagasena introduced himself. The king asked, "Are you Nagasena?" And he said, "Nagasena is my name. My designation, but I don't identify with it." Something like that, he said. And the king kind of joked and scoffed at him and said, "Well, if there's no Nagasena there, who takes on arms round? Who goes on arms round? And if who is murdered? And if you were murdered, there would be no crime. I mean, there's nobody to be murdered. Who takes that?" And Nagasena went about explaining about not self. He went about explaining about emptiness. And he asked the king, "How did you get here? Did you come by horseback, or how did you get here?" And he said, "I came by chariot." And Nagasena said, "Well, where is the chariot? Is it in the reins? Is it in the wheels? Is it in the framework? Is it in the horse? Where is the chariot?" And King Menander realized that chariot was a mere concept. And in that same way, he then realized that the self, the thing we call the self, is a mere concept. So coming back to compassion and boundlessness. Boundlessness, another way of describing boundlessness, in my view, is non-duality. Duality means that there is, this is the way we normally relate to the world and ourselves. We relate through a non-dual process. Duality means that we relate to the world as me in here and it out there, us and them, me and it, or me and you, and so on and so forth. Non-duality is about breaking down those boundaries, breaking down that bifurcation of me and it, so that there's just the experience of being. So there's a lot of meditation processes about focusing on emptiness. And what we realize is that when we start to think of the divisions between me and it, me and you, we realize that those divisions are just concepts. But I'm sitting here now, for example, and I'm creating concepts of you out there in the world somewhere. Some of you are in Hong Kong. One of you may be in America. No, I think she's gone. Somebody is in the Blue Mountains and so on. There's this sort of sense of separation. It's my creation. I'm creating a universe out there. And even if I sit here now and I think, oh, my body's here, and that light or the computer screen's over there, there's this conceptual separation. What we begin to realize that our sense of separateness is just a concept. It's just a mental creation. So one can say, okay, what about the three flows of compassion? Self to other, other to self, and self to self. How does this work out with compassion? What happens with that? Well, the answer is that kind of those three flows become redundant. And what happens is there's just the experience of compassion. Just the experience of compassion. So it's easy sometimes when we're practicing towards emptiness, it's easy to be deceived by it. It's easy to fall into the near enemy of equanimity. Now, equanimity is this state of mind that's balanced, unshaken. It sees the way things are. It's a wisdom quality, and it sees that it sees that only we can be responsible for our own behaviors and thoughts and actions and behaviors, and that other people can't be responsible for the way we feel, think, and behave. So equanimity is a wisdom quality, and it's easy for there to be, and there's near and far enemies of equanimity. The far enemy of equanimity is overreactivity, taking everything personally, feeling responsible for everybody's behaviors and the way people are. So you can see that there's a confusion. There's a lack of seeing clearly the way things are. The near enemy of equanimity looks like equanimity, but it's actually a deceptive and distorted version of it. In this case, one might feel kind of aloof, separate, detached, disengaged, dissociated. Somebody falls over and hurts themselves. Oh, that's just their karma. It's got nothing to do with me. So that's a near enemy of equanimity. It's not really the genuine aspect of equanimity. And we have equanimity as a heart quality because it helps us. It's a way of kind of connecting. It's this sense of being connected and engaged at the same time of understanding that differentiation between self and other. So what happens with some people when they're practicing emptiness, they're actually developing this near enemy of equanimity. And on a retreat that I was led by Analio, that I've attended, and I think he says this quite often actually, he said this following statement: compassion without emptiness is exhausting, while emptiness without compassion is toxic. So you just think about that for a moment. Compassion without emptiness is exhausting. In other words, it's that empathy fatigue. Compassion without seeing the reality of things, the reality that that beings are streams of dependently arising processes and interactions. To see that reality without seeing compassion, without seeing that reality, is in fact the near enemy of compassion. Is in fact this like empathy fatigue. Excuse me a minute. So compassion without emptiness is exhausting. while emptiness without compassion is toxic. You think about emptiness without compassion, that equals the near enemy of equanimity, that kind of dissociated, disengaged, aloof, sometimes even superiority, a sense of superiority that I'm above everybody else. There's still, people are still identifying with it. So that is toxic. So when we're practicing when we're practicing compassion at this boundless state, in this boundless way, what happens is we rouse it, we absorb into it, then we just realize the boundlessness of things. That that being that I might have brought up in my mind to rouse my compassion is actually a concept. Even myself is a concept. And what I have is just this experience of compassion. It's boundless. It has no bounds. It's immeasurable. Because the boundaries we place on the world and things, people, places, and things, is our own creation. So we can abide in this boundless divine abode. And it is freedom. While we're there, it is free. It is a taste of freedom. We are abiding in this Chitta Vimutti. Chitta Vimutti. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I trust that perhaps the talk was helpful, and may we all be free from suffering and its causes. Thank you. So let's have a few moments quietude, and then open up for some questions and discussions and comments, so on.